In this episode, we examine when dumb Karens got mauled by deadly animals, from a brown bear encounter on an Alaskan salmon stream to a Cape Buffalo's devastating charge on a South African walking safari. But first, we begin in the American West, where one woman's refusal to respect a moose's space turns a scenic roadside stop into a nightmare. It was June 14th, 2016, and a warm morning sun already hung over the willow flats of Grand Teton National Park in northwestern Wyoming. Deep into the summer tourist season, vehicles lined the narrow roads that wound through the park's broad valley, where moose browsed among the dense willow thickets within sight of the pavement. Roadside pull-offs overflowed with visitors photographing the massive animals from their cars and the designated viewing areas. Gaynell Crostwick, a 44-year-old lifestyle consultant from Darien, Connecticut, had arrived in Wyoming 2 days earlier with her husband, Breck, 48, a wealth management director. The trip had been planned around content for Gaynell's curated social media presence, which she maintained as a secondary brand alongside her consulting work. She had spent the previous day photographing elk from the car and had grown increasingly frustrated with the distance between the animals and the road. On the drive back to their cabin, she had told Breck that the trip was becoming a waste unless she could get images that matched the quality of wildlife accounts she competed with online. Breck had suggested they enjoy the scenery without the pressure of content, but Gaynell had dismissed the idea. The next morning, she packed a telephoto lens and a backup battery and told him they were leaving before sunrise to find something worth posting. The couple had pulled into a meadow overlook where a large cow moose stood browsing at the edge of a willow stand, approximately 50 yards from the gravel shoulder. A posted sign at the pull-off instructed visitors to remain at least 25 yards from wildlife. Several families stood near their vehicles, photographing the moose with phone cameras from the roadside. Gaynell exited the vehicle carrying a professional-grade camera and immediately expressed dissatisfaction with the distance. She told Breck the photos would be useless from this range and that the light was already shifting. She glanced at the families lined up along the roadside with their phones and shook her head. She walked past the sign and directly into the meadow grass toward the browsing cow. Breck called after her to come back. A nearby visitor also warned her she was too close. Gaynell waved them off without turning around, continuing her approach. She stopped roughly 30 yards from the moose, raised her camera, and began shooting. The cow continued pulling at willow branches, her tall, dark frame towering above the brush. Gaynell moved again, closing the distance further to what witnesses later estimated at roughly 15 to 20 yards. Moose are the largest members of the deer family, with adults standing roughly 5 to 6.5 feet tall at the shoulder and weighing between 900 and 1,500 pounds. Despite their size, moose are surprisingly agile and capable of sudden bursts of speed, reaching roughly 35 miles per hour over short distances. Unlike animals that often stand their ground, moose are highly defensive and react aggressively when they feel cornered or when a person approaches too closely. Most moose attacks involve the animal charging and knocking the victim down before stomping repeatedly with their long, powerful front legs. In places like Alaska, moose injure more people each year than bears, largely because they live close to roads and towns. Witnesses later reported that the cow had raised her head and turned directly toward Gaynell. Her ears flattened back against her head, and she fixed Gaynell with a direct stare. These warning signs often precede a defensive charge, though many inexperienced visitors fail to recognize them. Gaynell adjusted her camera angle and stepped forward again. The moose surged forward in a sudden charge, closing the distance in seconds. Gaynell turned to run, but had barely taken 2 steps before the animal struck her from behind, knocking her down as its front legs lashed out. Once she was on the ground, the moose began stomping with its long front legs, hammering downward with its long front hooves onto her torso and head with tremendous force. The moose stomped repeatedly for roughly 10 to 15 seconds before backing away several steps and turning quickly toward the willow brush. Breck sprinted toward his wife. Other visitors were already calling emergency services. Gaynell lay motionless in the meadow grass, her injuries visible and catastrophic. The stomping had inflicted severe crushing trauma to her chest, shoulders, and skull. She was unresponsive with catastrophic cranial and chest injuries. Emergency responders arrived roughly 15 to 25 minutes later, but Gaynell Crostwick was pronounced dead before reaching the nearest hospital. Investigators later noted that a young calf had been lying in the taller grass roughly 20 yards behind the adult moose, likely hidden from view by the vegetation. Cow moose are notoriously aggressive when defending calves and will attack perceived threats with little hesitation. The incident report noted that she had walked past a clearly posted warning sign and approached a wild moose well inside the minimum safety distance. While Wyoming's valley had delivered its most permanent lesson in wildlife distance, the forests of northern India would soon prove equally unforgiving for a tourist who treated a predator's territory as her personal photo studio. It was February 8, 2015, and the winter sun hung low over the dry, deciduous forests of a tiger reserve in Rajasthan. The reserve's jeep safari routes wound through scrubby ravines and open grassland where sambar deer, langurs, and wild boar moved along the forest edges. Leopard sightings were uncommon but not rare, particularly during the cooler months when the cats hunted along the periphery of the reserve's denser zones. Jessamine Thornwell, a 50-year-old British national living in Dubai, had built a career in luxury interior sourcing, furnishing high-end residences across the Gulf states. Her social media presence featured heavily curated travel photography, and she had booked a private jeep safari specifically to capture images that would distinguish her feed from the competition. The jeep was operated by Devraj Kathuria, a 42-year-old driver and naturalist who had guided safaris through the reserve for over 12 years. The jeep had been temporarily separated from other safari vehicles along the route that morning, leaving Kathuria alone with Thornwell on a quiet stretch of track. His morning briefing had been standard. Visitors were to remain inside the vehicle at all times. Flash photography was prohibited near animals. The driver's judgment regarding animal proximity was final. Approximately 90 minutes into the excursion, the jeep had stopped several times for distant deer sightings and a brief view of a marsh crocodile basking on a dry riverbed, none of which had satisfied Thornwell. She had spent most of the drive scrolling through other photographers' feeds on her phone, showing Kathuria the close-range predator shots she expected to replicate. Kathuria nodded politely and continued driving. Then, along a quiet stretch bordered by dry grass and scattered dock trees, Kathuria slowed the jeep and pointed toward a stretch of tall golden grass roughly 30 feet from the track. He spoke quietly, indicating that a leopard had been feeding on a kill somewhere in the grass, based on alarm calls from langurs in the overhead canopy and drag marks visible at the edge of the vegetation. The cat was not visible, but Kathuria was certain it was lying up with its prey in the dense cover. Thornwell stood up in the jeep for a better angle, but the grass obscured everything. She demanded Kathuria drive off the track and closer. Kathuria refused, explaining that leaving the designated route was prohibited, and that approaching a leopard on a kill was exceptionally dangerous, as the animals become highly defensive of fresh prey. Thornwell pressed him, suggesting she understood the risks and that his excessive caution was ruining an experience she had paid a premium for. She told him she would personally ensure his employer heard about his unwillingness to deliver the advertised experience. Kathuria did not move the vehicle. Thornwell climbed out of the jeep. Kathuria immediately told her to get back inside. He shouted for her to stop and moved to follow, but she had already stepped off the track and into the grass margin, her phone held in front of her as she moved toward the area where the leopard was believed to be feeding. She walked slowly, scanning the grass ahead, closing the distance until she was roughly 10 to 15 feet from the concealed cat. Indian leopards are among the most adaptable and dangerous predators on the subcontinent, responsible for multiple fatal attacks each year across parts of rural India. Adult females typically weigh between 65 to 100 pounds, but their strength vastly exceeds what their size suggests. Leopards rely on ambush tactics, using dense cover to remain invisible until prey moves within striking range. Their attack is explosive, covering short distances in a single bound, with powerful jaws targeting the neck and throat to achieve a quick kill. Leopards are most dangerous when guarding a fresh kill, as the combination of defensive aggression and close proximity creates conditions for an attack that unfolds faster than any human can react. Investigators later determined, based on the position of the body and the animal's tracks in the soft earth, that the leopard had flattened into the grass as Thornwell approached, a classic pre-strike posture triggered by a perceived threat to its kill. Thornwell had almost certainly closed the distance without realizing the cat was directly beneath her, the animal's camouflage rendering it virtually invisible in the dry golden grass until she was within arm's reach. Cornered against its prey and unable to retreat without being detected, the leopard's defensive response was instantaneous. Kathuria, watching from the jeep, saw the grass erupt. The leopard launched from concealment, covering the short distance in a blur of explosive movement. The cat struck Thornwell from slightly below and to the side, its claws raking across her arm as its jaws clamped around her throat, compressing the windpipe. The force drove her to the ground. Thornwell's scream was cut short as the leopard's grip tightened, restricting airflow and blood flow to the brain. Cathuria laid on the horn and revved the engine, attempting to drive the leopard off. The cat released and disappeared into the grass within moments, but the damage was catastrophic. Cathuria radioed for emergency assistance and reached Thornwell within seconds. She was unresponsive, with severe trauma to the throat and neck. Reserve medical staff arrived within 30 minutes, but Jessamine Thornwell had died in the grass beside the track. The investigation confirmed she had exited the vehicle and approached a leopard guarding a fresh kill in direct violation of the reserve's safety protocols. Cathuria was cleared of any liability. While the forests of Rajasthan had punished one tourist's recklessness, the remote waterways of Australia's Northern Territory would soon deliver an even more devastating outcome for a woman who treated crocodile warning signs as suggestion. It was September 23, 2017, and the dry season had baked the Northern Territory landscape into cracked red earth and receding waterways. River levels across the region had dropped to their lowest point, concentrating wildlife along shrinking pools and gorges. Saltwater crocodiles, already territorial by nature, became more densely packed and aggressive as their habitat contracted. Karenza Witherow, a 47-year-old real estate agent from Sydney, had traveled north with her friend Narelle for a 2-week holiday through the territory's remote gorge country. Witherow had a reputation among friends for being difficult with service staff and dismissive of rules she considered beneath her. The trip's itinerary included guided excursions through several river gorge systems popular with tourists. At a remote river access point, a local operator ran short boat tours along a stretch of tidal river known for crocodile sightings. Witherow and Narelle had arrived hoping to swim at a gorge pool that appeared on a travel blog Witherow had bookmarked months earlier. When they inquired about swimming, the operator told them bluntly that the river section was closed to swimming due to confirmed crocodile presence. He pointed to the warning signs posted at the boat ramp and along the bank. Swimming meant accepting the risk of death, and he would not be responsible. Witherow told him the blog had featured swimmers at this exact location and accused him of exaggerating the danger to sell boat tours. She pulled up the blog post on her phone and showed him the photographs, pointing at the water and then back at the screen. The operator glanced at the images, told her the photos were at least 5 years old and that conditions had changed, and repeated his refusal. He walked away. Narelle urged Witherow to let it go and join the boat tour instead. Witherow declined the tour. She told Narelle she had not driven 8 hours to look at a river from a boat. While Narelle stayed near the vehicle, Witherow walked approximately 200 yards downstream along the bank, past the posted warning signs, moving through patches of pandanus and paperbark that lined the river's edge. The bank was quiet. Insects droned in the midday heat, and the water moved sluggishly, its surface brown and opaque. A second crocodile warning sign, its red lettering faded by sun but still legible, stood at an angle near the waterline. Witherow walked past it without slowing. She reached a section where the receding water had created a shallow, sandy entry point. She set her bag on the bank and waded into the murky water, the river bottom soft beneath her feet. She had entered roughly waist-deep water near the bank's edge when the attack occurred. Saltwater crocodile males are the largest living reptiles on Earth, with large males often reaching 14 to 17 feet, with exceptional individuals exceeding that, and weighing over 1,000 pounds. They possess one of the most powerful bite forces ever recorded in a living animal. Their ambush strategy relies on remaining motionless near the bank or just below the surface, virtually invisible in murky water, before launching with explosive speed. The attack sequence involves clamping onto the victim and dragging it beneath the surface, often rolling violently once the prey is underwater to disorient and tear tissue before drowning. According to investigators, the crocodile had likely been lying just beneath the surface near the bank, concealed by the murky water and overhanging vegetation. Narelle, watching from the distance, reported hearing a sudden violent splash, followed by a scream that was cut short almost immediately. The crocodile struck at the water's edge, its massive jaws clamping onto her torso near the hip as the animal exploded from concealment. The crocodile dragged her beneath the surface before beginning the violent death roll. The water churned violently before settling back to stillness. Narelle later described a brief, terrifying disturbance that ceased almost as quickly as it had begun. Emergency services were contacted immediately. A search operation involving wildlife rangers and police launched within the hour, but the murky conditions and confirmed crocodile presence made recovery extremely dangerous. Fragmentary remains were recovered downstream over the following 2 days, consistent with crocodile feeding and caching behavior. The investigation confirmed that Witherow had entered the water voluntarily at a location clearly marked with crocodile warning signs, well outside any supervised area. The operator was cleared of all liability. While Australia's rivers had claimed Carenza Withero, the salmon streams of coastal Alaska would soon witness another confrontation between entitlement and raw animal power, this time involving North America's largest coastal predator. It was August 11th, 2014, and fog clung to the valleys along Alaska's southern coast, where glacier-fed streams cut through dense spruce forest on their way to the sea. The salmon runs were nearing their peak, drawing massive concentrations of coastal brown bears to the region's rivers and creating one of North America's premier wildlife viewing opportunities. Truden Bashart, a 52-year-old homeowners association president from Scottsdale, Arizona, had booked a bear viewing excursion through a regional outfitter that operated along a remote salmon stream accessible only by float plane. Bashart's approach to travel mirrored her approach to her HOA, treating every interaction as a confrontation to be dominated and every limitation as a personal affront. The excursion included Bashart and 4 other guests, led by a veteran guide who carried bear spray and a large-caliber rifle as a last resort defense. He conducted an extensive safety briefing before the group departed the float plane landing. The rules were clear. Visitors would observe from an elevated wooden platform positioned 30 yards from the stream. No one was to leave the platform under any circumstances. Bears had the right of way. The guide's instructions were final. The group reached the platform and spent the first hour watching 3 bears fishing in the shallows approximately 40 yards downstream. The other guests were captivated, whispering excitedly as a large male hauled a sockeye salmon from the current and tore into it on a gravel bar. Bashart was unimpressed. She complained repeatedly that the bears were too far, the platform too high, and the experience nothing like the photographs she had seen in the outfitter's brochure. She asked another guest to move aside because he was blocking her angle, then turned to the guide and told him that for the price she had paid, she expected to be close enough to see the fish in the bears' mouths. The guide explained that the platform's distance was calibrated for safety and that approaching the stream on foot during peak salmon season, when bears were concentrated and protective of feeding territory, was not an option. Bashart dismissed his explanation. She demanded he escort her to the stream bank for a closer photograph. The guide refused. She then turned to the other guests and asked whether any of them found this acceptable for the price they had paid, attempting to recruit allies. The other 4 guests said nothing. Bashart announced that she would be filing a formal complaint with the outfitter and posting reviews detailing his incompetence on every travel platform she could find. The guide acknowledged her frustration, but did not change his position. During a brief period when the guide was attending to another guest's question, Bashart climbed down from the platform and walked along the bank toward the stream, her camera raised. She moved quickly, covering roughly 25 yards before the guide noticed her absence and shouted for her to stop. She did not turn around. Coastal brown bears are the largest subspecies of grizzly bear in North America, with adult females commonly weighing between 400 and 700 pounds, and males exceeding 1,000 pounds. During the salmon runs, these bears concentrate along streams in extraordinary densities, fiercely defending prime fishing spots from rivals. Sows with cubs are particularly dangerous, as they perceive any unfamiliar presence near their young as a direct threat. A charging brown bear can reach speeds approaching 35 miles per hour, covering 50 yards in roughly 4 seconds, and their claws, measuring up to 4 inches, can open deep lacerations with a single swipe. Bite force is estimated at around 1,000 pounds per square inch, sufficient to crush bone. A sow with 2 spring cubs had been fishing in a shallow riffle approximately 30 yards upstream from the platform, partially concealed behind a gravel bar and dense bankside brush. Bashart's path along the stream bank brought her suddenly into close proximity with the cubs. The sow exploded from behind the gravel bar with little warning beyond the crashing brush. Roughly 500 pounds of protective fury closed the distance in seconds. Bashart turned at the sound of crashing brush but had no time to react. The bear struck her with a powerful forepaw swipe that raked across her upper body, the claws tearing through clothing and flesh. The impact knocked her to the ground. The sow was on her immediately, biting down on Bashart's shoulder and shaking with tremendous force. The crushing pressure shattered her collarbone and tore deep into the muscle. The bear released briefly before biting and shaking her upper body again. The mauling lasted less than 15 seconds before the sow disengaged, retreating to her cubs and moving them upstream away from the scene. The guide reached Bashart within a minute, but the injuries were catastrophic and unsurvivable. Emergency services were contacted via satellite phone, and a float plane evacuation was arranged. Truden Bashart was pronounced dead at the scene. The investigation determined she had left the designated viewing platform without authorization and entered an active bear fishing zone during peak salmon season. The guide and outfitter were cleared of liability. While Alaska's salmon streams had delivered a fatal reminder of brown bear territory, thousands of miles away on the South African bushveld, the most dangerous encounter was still to come. In a private game reserve bordering elephant and buffalo country, one woman's relentless aggression toward a young guide would carry her straight into the path of Africa's most unpredictable killer. It was July 19, 2018, and the winter bushveld of South Africa's eastern lowlands stretched in muted browns and grays beneath a pale sky. The dry season had stripped the landscape bare, concentrating game along the remaining water sources and creating exceptional conditions for walking safaris, the most immersive and dangerous form of wildlife viewing on the continent. Sabella Hartwell, a 46-year-old corporate attorney from London, had arrived at a small private game reserve 3 days earlier as part of a luxury safari package. Hartwell had already filed a formal complaint with the lodge manager regarding the quality of the evening meal on her first night, and had sent a pointed email to the booking agency describing the accommodation as below the standard she had been promised. The morning walking safari departed shortly after sunrise, led by Thando Ndaba, a 28-year-old trails guide who had grown up in the region and held advanced certification through the National Wildlife Authority. Ndaba carried a .375H and H rifle and was accompanied by a tracker moving slightly ahead of the group, reading the ground for fresh animal signs. The group included Hartwell and 2 other guests, a couple from Germany who would later provide witness statements. Ndaba's safety briefing was thorough. The group would walk in single file behind the tracker. No one was to break formation. If a dangerous game was encountered, all guests were to remain still and silent behind the guide. His instructions were final and non-negotiable. The first 90 minutes passed without incident, the group observing giraffe, zebra, and impala from a comfortable distance. At one point, the tracker raised his hand and the group froze as a large kudu buffalo crossed the path ahead, his spiraled horns catching the early light. The German couple exchanged delighted glances. Hartwell checked her watch. She grew visibly impatient, complaining that the pace was too slow and the route too predictable. She told Ndaba she had not paid for a nature walk, and that she had expected a dangerous game by now, not antelope. She demanded he lead the group toward a waterhole she could see in the distance, roughly 300 yards off the route Ndaba had chosen for the walk, where dark shapes were visible in the bush. Ndaba explained that the shapes were almost certainly Cape buffalo, and that approaching a waterhole where buffalo were drinking on foot was extremely dangerous. He had observed a solitary Daga boy in the area on previous walks, an old buffalo that had been expelled from the herd, which are widely considered the single most dangerous animal to encounter on foot in Africa. Hartwell dismissed his assessment, telling him that she had been on walking safaris before and that his reluctance was an embarrassment to the lodge. The German couple attempted to mediate, but Hartwell cut them off. She told Ndaba she would be contacting the reserve owner directly and that his guiding career at this lodge was finished. She then broke formation and walked ahead of the tracker, moving off the trail toward the waterhole at a brisk pace. Cape buffalo are among Africa's most dangerous large animals, responsible for more fatal encounters with hunters and villagers than most other large African herbivores. Adult buffalo S weigh between 1,100 and 2,000 pounds, with heavily bossed horns capable of penetrating vital organs with devastating force. Solitary Daga boys, old buffalo S expelled from their herds, are considered the most dangerous of all, as they are unpredictable, aggressive, and often resting in dense shade near water sources. Unlike many prey animals that flee when threatened, wounded or agitated buffalo are known to circle back and ambush their pursuers. Their thick hide and dense skull structure make them extraordinarily difficult to stop, even with large-caliber rifles. Hartwell had covered roughly 20 yards off the trail when the undergrowth erupted. The Daga boy had been resting in a thicket of dense bush barely 20 yards from where she stepped into the brush, invisible in the dry scrub. The buffalo charged with explosive acceleration, a wall of dark muscle and horn crashing through the brush with a speed that belied its enormous size. Ndaba shouted and raised his rifle, but Hartwell was directly in his line of fire. The buffalo's right horn caught Hartwell in the abdomen, the impact driving her backward off her feet as the animal surged forward. The horn drove deep into her abdomen, and the buffalo shook its massive head once before throwing her to the ground. The buffalo trampled across her torso as it surged past, then wheeled and crashed back into the thicket. Ndaba reached Hartwell within seconds, rifle ready in case the buffalo returned. The horn had caused a deep, penetrating wound to her abdomen, and the impact had collapsed several ribs. She was unresponsive and losing blood rapidly. Ndaba applied pressure and radioed the lodge for emergency evacuation, while the tracker kept watch for the buffalo. A vehicle reached the scene within 20 minutes, but Sabella Hartwell was pronounced dead before reaching the nearest medical facility. The cause of death was determined to be catastrophic penetrating trauma to the torso and multiple rib fracture. The investigation confirmed that Hartwell had broken formation and left the designated trail against the guide's explicit instructions, entering dense bush near a waterhole in an area known to harbor a solitary Daga boy. Ndaba and the reserve were cleared of all liability. The Daga boy was not destroyed, as wildlife authorities determined the animal had responded defensively to an intruder entering its resting area. Thanks for watching. Want to see more? Click on your screen now